Misinformation seems everywhere these days, and the talk will be relevant to anyone who's interested in the spread of misinformation. So I'll talk a little about, what makes humans susceptible to believing in misinformation, and then looking at evidence-based interventions in terms of what we can do to counter it, including some of the problems with traditional debunking and a new concept known as pre-bunking or psychological inoculation, which is all about the idea of vaccinating people against misinformation by exposing them and refuting a weakened dose of it in advance.
Welcome to TALK.CYBERCNI.fr.
Bienvenue. So, welcome to the 41st edition of TALK.CYBERCNI. What a nice journey so far. And today, as usual, we'll focus on cybersecurity, things around cybersecurity to make you better informed about the important topics. And today we have a super important topic that is super important for you, because it's about the use of AI, the use of generative models for fake news. This is something we covered already before. You might have seen and heard that there is now a new model by OpenAI, which is called Sora, that is coming out. There is the possibility to have AI characters in your video conferences, and this is truly a game changer. So for me, this is the end of where you can say if something is true news or fake news, because it really means that everything at lifetime can be generated. The quality will significantly continue to increase. And so what might have started in the modern media with the first Iraq war, which was changing the images or selective publication of images in order to influence the opinion of the public, is today super cheap. You can do it. You can buy credits on OpenAI. You can create videos. You can create whatever. It might even be possible very soon to just write an idea, and then afterwards it creates you a film. So really amazing times, and therefore I'm super happy that today we have Sander van der Linden from Cambridge University, who will be talking about psychological inoculation against misinformation, which is a good possibility to do something with the situation, because our human brain is not at all made for reacting to these tons of computer-generated content that seems super real to us. But before we get to that, as always, the explanation of the second screen. So the second screen is in Slido. Please connect to it today, the talk 41, not surprising, as usual, our tag, 41st edition. So go to the Slido, because there you have the second screen. You can participate in the discussion. You can ask your questions. You can upvote and downvote questions. So take this possibility, because as always, the format will be that we first have a presentation by Sander, and afterwards we have a discussion, which takes also roughly 45 minutes, where we'll discuss a bit about the topics he'll be talking about and the topics that you ask in the chat. So really use the opportunity, and we are looking forward already to both parts. To give you a quick introduction to Sander. So Sander van der Linden, he is a professor of social psychology in society and director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. He has won numerous awards for his research on human judgment, communication, and decision-making, including the Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science. He co-developed the award-winning fake news game Bad News, and regularly advises governments, public health authorities, and social media companies on how to combat the spread of misinformation. He is ranked among the top 1% of highly cited social scientists worldwide, and has published over 175 research papers. His research is regularly covered in outlets such as New York Times, BBC, NPR, Rolling Stone. Before joining Cambridge, he held academic positions at Princeton, Yale, and the LSE. He's the author of Foolproof: Why We Fall for Misinformation and How to Build Immunity, which was named of Nature's top science books and the recipient of the Best Book Prize from the American Psychological Association, the British Psychological Society, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the Harvard Schwarzstein Center. So, great having you here, Sander, and without further ado, I hand over to you and look forward to an exciting presentation.
Thanks so much. That was the whole biography in detail. Quite a task. Let me do full screen here. Let's see. Am I good? Does everyone see this? Um, Perfect. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks so much again for that generous introduction, and very happy today to speak to everyone about the idea of inoculating people against misinformation. Before I do so, it's a bit funnier in person, but I usually have this little quiz, especially with the expert audience on, some of these issues. And so here's three headlines. One of them is true, so two of them are fake. Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. Baby born in California was named hard eyes emoji, or a criminal farts so loudly he gives away his hiding place. Now, when I ask people which one of these is true, most people don't think that A is true, so they have some faith in Putin. Most people actually think B is true, and in fact, when I give this talk in California, most people think that B is true as well. But actually, the right answer is C. This really happened in the U.S., where some guy was hiding in the bushes and he passed gas so loudly that he gave away his own hiding place, and the sheriff's department even tweeted, "When you're having a hashtag shit day." Um, but the point is, beyond the fart jokes, the point is that actually it can be quite difficult to spot what's true or false based on just a headline. We've actually developed a more serious test, kind of like this, but in a more extended form called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is a psychometrically validated instrument. It's been benchmarked against the US and the UK population. We just did the Netherlands, so we're expanding to other countries. About, it takes 2 minutes. We have a short, long version, gives you an idea of how discerning you are versus how gullible versus how naive or distrusting you are, so you get a pattern of results. Took a few years to validate this because obviously it's a bit trickier with news than, let's say, personality traits, because news changes over time. So it's not perfect, but it does seem to correlate and predict a lot of relevant things, people's performance of this test. For example, it correlates with admin data on vaccine uptake, geographically distributed, so people who are higher in susceptibility or lower to get vaccinated, for example. And if you look at who's susceptible to misinformation, YouGov uses this measure and did a report on it, and they found that people get their news from social media, for example, do pretty much the worst on this test. People are getting their news from Instagram and TikTok versus people who get their news from legacy media. Surprisingly, younger generations, Gen Z, millennials, also do pretty badly on this test, even though they're digital natives. So there's quite some interesting variation in there. Other indicators of susceptibility to misinformation include people who are politically extreme, high on distrust, high on paranoia, low on analytical thinking, stuff like that. Of course, I perhaps don't have to tell you about some of the consequences of misinformation during the pandemic. People were setting phone masts on fire because they thought that 5G was causing or exacerbating the coronavirus. Not just a Western phenomenon. I mean, in Iran, people were hospitalized because they were drinking methanol because they read on social media that it cures the virus, including children. Of course, in the UK, we've had the riots here that were fueled by misinformation on social media about an assailant. Total false story. There was some asylum seeker who arrived by boat to attack children. Now, of course, the stabbing was a real incident, but the story about the assailant was totally fake. But it caused a lot of offline violence. Similar in the U.S., where people are spreading misinformation about immigrant communities that Haitian families were eating cats and dogs, which again leads to racist attacks. This is, as Mark Oliver alluded to, this is a cheap fake of a military convoy heading to Ukraine during the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This went viral on Facebook, but turns out this is a train in Southern California, nothing to do with Ukraine. We have Putin's claim that Ukraine is full of Nazis, and that was his excuse for invading the country. We had the Capitol riots in the U.S., conspiracy that the election was stolen, of course, mobilizing um, thousands of people to storm the Capitol, some of the more intense consequences of the spread of conspiracy theories. Lots of manipulated imagery during the Israel Hamas conflict as well. And what I'm interested in is kind of the propaganda technique. So, what's interesting to me is that a lot of the fake footage from this conflict on X and other places is actually recycled from from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They typically use Arma 3 footage, which is a first-person shooter game, and it looks realistic. But what's interesting is that some of these techniques are recycled. Violent intergroup conflict, that's a great situation for manipulated imagery of military attacks that can confuse people. Here's a gentleman during the pandemic in the US about how the mRNA vaccine is going to change your DNA. Now, again, what's interesting, so I'm not a fact checker, right? I'm not the arbiter of truth, but I'm a psychologist. I'm interested in how people think about these issues. And what's interesting to me is the kind of historical repetition of propaganda. So if you go back, you might say, oh, people have questions. It's a new technology. Fair enough, right? But the idea that the vaccine is going to change your DNA, that's actually 200 years old. If you go back to the first vaccine, which was Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox back in the 1800s, if you look at the literature and the art, you had people, anti-vax communities, creating images of cows sprouting out of people's mouths and ears. So here's an example where there's udders coming out of people's eyes and mouths. And the whole idea was that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you were going to turn into a human cow hybrid. So the idea that the vaccine is going to change your body has actually been around for 200 years, but somehow we fail to anticipate some of these manipulation techniques. So people always say, okay, what do you mean by misinformation? What's false and what's misleading? Um, so misinformation to me is false or misleading information, right? But it can include simple errors, whereas disinformation is misinformation coupled with some intention to actually deceive or harm other people. So the purposeful spread of false or misleading information, and political or corporate propaganda is disinformation with some kind of agenda, right? Often mixed with a grain of truth, but the idea is to manipulate people in the service of some political agenda. So the term fake news is not so helpful because it doesn't provide a technical differentiation of these concepts. But I provide this definition because it's quite important. So I love this consensus report for the American Psychological Association trying to figure out what misinformation is. And the definition that we came up with was actually one that should be independent of source or intent, and actually stressing the importance of not only false but also misleading information. Because if you look at ecosystem studies, the stuff that's obviously false, like reptile politicians and flat Earth, most people are not exposed to a ton of that kind of stuff. But so the problem may seem quite small if you just focus on ridiculous false information, but actually misleading information, right? That's talking about bias, hyperpartisan, lack of context, logical fallacies, opinion presented as fact. That's a much bigger problem, and much more common. And so we like to include both under the definition of misinformation. And I'll tell you, I'll say a little bit more about this the idea of sources and in particular, because it is an attractive idea that we need to teach people about sources, and in Western democracies that generally works, but there's plenty of countries where there are no necessarily independent sources, right? And so there are some issues with some of these definitions. So in my field, there's three ways of thinking about how to operationalize research, and one is to just rely on fact checkers. So there's a list of fake news content that's been fact checked by Snopes or PolitiFact, and those are the items that you use to test people with. And that's fine, but most news isn't fact checked. And in fact, the process by which something gets selected for a fact check is selective, but often based on obviously false things. So you miss out on actually important stuff. So if you look at the level of the source or the publisher, there are lists of dodgy publishers. Places like NewsGuard, they rate on a scale of 1 to 7 pretty much every major website on the internet in terms of how trustworthy they are, news sites. So you can go at the source level, but of course, some mainstream sources can also publish misinformation, and that's often much more consequential because they have credibility rather than some random fake news website. So Mark Oliver mentioned Iraq. In fact, the war on Iraq is a good example. So the New York Times, had printed false headlines that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Which they later retracted and apologized for spreading misinformation. And of course, that's what a good editorial outlet does. They correct course and apologize. But nonetheless, it's been shown that for decades, people continue to think that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because of these headlines that were printed. And so we're not so concerned with giving people the right source or pointing them to fact checks, but we want to help people identify manipulation techniques and misinformation techniques in general. So we want to calibrate people's judgments, not tell them a simplistic binary of true or false, because most stuff isn't just entirely true, entirely false. We want to help calibrate people's judgments as a function of manipulation. So here's an example. Health Impact News is a fake news website, and vitamin C also doesn't protect against coronavirus. This has been fact checked as false, so that's simple. But now look at this one. So the Chicago Tribune is a Pulitzer Prize winning outlet. So in the U.S. So from the source, this isn't a fake news source. This headline also wasn't fact checked as false because a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine. But what's happening, of course, here is a fallacy that's being deployed, which is to imply causation where there's only correlation, right? So the correlation causation fallacy, and also a clickbait, framing technique, which implies that the doctor died because of the vaccine, even though there was absolutely no evidence that one had anything to do with the other. But the anti-vax community, was very keen on sharing this headline. In fact, it became one of the most shared headlines on Facebook. And if you look, this study was recently published in Science that I provided some commentary on, is that this type of headline that is subtly manipulative but not overtly false was 50 times more impactful on vaccination intentions than fact-checked misinformation that was obviously false. And so the stuff that's misleading, I'm much more concerned about. And sometimes, that happens in science too, right? Socioeconomic position and the risk of brain tumor, right? All very technical. Then you get to the press release of the Journal of Epidemiology, right? Higher levels of education linked to heightened brain tumor risk. And then we get to the Daily Mirror, and then why going to university increases risk of getting a brain tumor. Of course, that is misinformation when you frame it like that. And so, in this sort of pipeline of news production, there are some dodgy things that happen, and we want to make people aware of those. And so, here's a pivoting now to solutions. So here's a picture of Madrid, 3.5 million people in Madrid, tons of people. Here's the flag of Spain. Here's all the people at the airport. Huge city, most populous city in Europe. So Madrid is the most populous city in Europe. Here's a chart of population growth in Madrid going up very high. There used to be London, but then there was this whole exit, right? And so Madrid is the most populous city now. Now, if I now tell you guys that in fact this was total bullshit, Madrid is not the most populous city in Europe, something funny needs to happen, which is that now you have to tag something that you've heard as false. So it's a negation. Negations are difficult for the brain because we integrate information quickly because it connects with other things that we know. We know that countries in Spain, we've heard of Madrid, vacations, cities in Europe, right? And so the brain is a network, and your memory is kind of like a social network, right? So there's nodes and links between them. And the problem is, the more I keep saying that Madrid is the most populous city in Europe, the stronger that connection becomes, and the more difficult it is to undo. And it's something we call the continued influence of misinformation. There's been lots of meta-analyses on this. That yes, you can partially correct misinformation. I'm not saying that fact-checking and debunking after the fact is bad. It's important, but it's not going to undo the damage. There's a famous example from the legal domain in the US and the UK. You have a jury system, right? So people who the jury hears something in the media about a defendant they weren't supposed to hear, and it just tells them to disregard it. You can't unring a bell. And the same is true with misinformation. And experiments show that people continue to use it in their reasoning in subtle ways, even when they acknowledge having seen a fact check, which is really problematic. And so there's neurological research that's been done on that, including some meta-analyses also showing that on average debunking is tricky. So these fMRI studies basically try to disentangle what's going wrong. And part of the answer is that sometimes people don't link the correction to the myth in their brain correctly. Because the myths tend to be short, sticky, resonates with what you want to believe about the world, and the correction is scientific, long, complex, doesn't resonate with you. And so actually people don't integrate the correction into their mental model. Another explanation is what we call retrieval error, which has more to do with the fact that people access information and misinformation concurrently in memory, and you have to suppress the false information. So when I now ask you for the most popular city in Europe, and I do apologize for this, there's going to be multiple activations. It's going to be Madrid, and then it's going to be, oh no, it wasn't Madrid. In fact, that's wrong. But I haven't told you what's true instead. Was that in the story, you really have to engage with the dark arts in order to learn how to beat it. And that's the gist of inoculation too. You need to be exposed to a simulated attack, which might resonate with the cybersecurity community, in order to withstand it and neutralize it in the future. Um, and so what we created a game, a digital game. This was the first fake news game at the time. It's called Bad News. It was a pun. We went a little overboard with the humor. I'll get to that in a second. The goal of Bad News is that we let people step into the shoes of an online manipulator. And we're not just focusing on a single falsehood, because you run into the same problem as fact checking often, that, well, what about the next one? What about the next one? So we wanted to get some broad scale immunity by focusing on the general techniques that are used across the production of misinformation. And then also, people make use of weakened doses of these techniques actively in a simulated sandbox environment, and they learn how to deconstruct and resist them, as part of the gameplay. And then we test people. So here you go. So here you got Donald Trump. This was during his initial presidency in 2016. After long deliberation with my generals, have decided to declare war on North Korea. Hashtag Kim Jong Un. So this is not something Trump said, but maybe could have said. What people don't notice is that we manipulated the Twitter handle. So it's an N instead of an M. This is part of what we call the impersonation technique. Um, and this ranges, from a Twitter handle to impersonating doctors on the internet, peddling fake cures, to the faking credibility of organizations. So impersonation is quite a wide range. So we use a weakened dose, right, to inoculate people against the building block, and then we test people with a whole range of examples. That's kind of the setup. So we've updated it now. Joe Biden, we had, as your president, I've issued an executive order to rename Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. For political balance, we always had, we have both left, right examples. You can make fun of the government, you can make fun of big corporations. Now Trump is back. So we have a joke about Elon Musk in the game too. He bought Fox News, and he has some plans. Total fake news, of course, but the Twitter handles are manipulated, and your goal is to gain as many followers without losing any credibility. Of course, if you're being ridiculous, you're not gaining any points. The mainstream media has one massive conspiracy. Here you're impersonating NASA, large space objects at U.S. West Coast. Hashtag be safe. So you're trending, and it's interactive, right? So people talk to you. You get cheered on, and you see feedback in terms of how you're doing. So there's 6 of these techniques that we started with, from a year of investigating, including interviewing people who work in troll farms and things like that. So polarizing headlines, right, creating us versus them mentalities. Impersonation, already talked about that. Conspiratorial reasoning. What are the building blocks of a good conspiracy theory? Trolling people. The use of emotions to manipulate people away from thinking about the evidence. Things like fear mongering and discrediting. Sowing doubt and using denial tactics, to deflect away from credible institutions and fact checkers and things like that. And people go on to become a fake news tycoon, and you move up a level. And of course, it's all fictional, right? They're weakened doses, so it's meant to be sarcastic and funny, so that nobody's actually duped because it's too ridiculous to be true. But it's ecologically valid insofar it's based on real examples. So the Trump one was based on a Warren Buffett tweet that, somebody impersonated Warren Buffett on Twitter back in the day, got hundreds of thousands of followers within minutes, tweeting fake investment advice, but it used the same trick, right? So it's based on real examples, but fictional. Then John Rosenbeek, who's here with his, lovely hair, um, programmed much of the game, also much of the humor. We're both Dutch, and so we have to apologize to the international community for some of our humor, and moderate it a little bit. But I think the great thing about Bad News is that it went viral on Reddit. So there's this thing called the Hug of Death, where there was so much traffic that they crashed our server, so we had to buy more cloud space. And it wasn't branded as an educational thing. We don't want to tell people what to believe. It was just a tool to help people. And so we got lots of big data, coming in. So people can take a quiz before and after, real simple, which was our initial experiment. So we had about, in the first few weeks, we got about 30,000 data points, 15,000 pairs of pre-post. And so what I'm showing you here are the bars for credible news that doesn't use manipulation, pre and post, and you can see here there are no changes. But for the tweets that use manipulation, people find them less credible, impersonation, conspiracy, deflection, after playing compared to before. These are the data distributions, these are medians. Didn't matter if you were left, right, conservative, younger, old, lower, higher educated. Sure, people start at different levels, but the intervention effect was similar across groups. Now, of course, lots of criticism about this. We only had a few items. It wasn't a randomized placebo trial. It was in the wild. Lots of things that were potentially confounded. And so we did a randomized controlled follow-up study with a control group who played Tetris. We got lots of messages from people asking them if we're paying them for 20 minutes to play Tetris. But yes, if you were in the control group, you were playing Tetris, a gamified control unrelated to misinformation. And we upped the number of items. So my student Melissa at the time, who now has her own company called Pulse, the idea was that we were looking at 18 items. So there's 6 techniques for reliability purposes, 3 items per technique, 18 items. This is the average on the y-axis. In the control group, nothing happening, so density is around 0. In the inoculation group, people find fake news less reliable, so density shifts to the left. But we also found that people became more confident in their beliefs, which is crucial because if you're not very confident, you're easily in your own ability, in your own truth discernment abilities, you're going to be easily persuaded by bad actors. And so in order to resist, you need to be confident, not overconfident. So we tested for that, but confident. And so we also see that effect here. And then we got lots of questions about, okay, so you created a game, simulated attacks, helps people, but how long does it last? Which is a good question, right? And so we started looking at this more systematically. So Raccoon, who was also one of our students now at Oxford, and he helped sort of uncover the decay curve of this experiment. We have a paper coming out soon, Nature Communications, where we look at all of our data, and you actually find we can model the decay of this intervention pretty accurately. And the idea is that we give people this 18-item quiz, the pretest, right? Then we randomize people to inoculation versus control. And then this is a bit nefarious in the inoculation literature, it's called an attack. So we attack people week after week after week with misinformation for a period up to 3 months to see how long the effect lasts, right? In the second experiment, we did nothing in between. We just follow up with people at the end of the 3-month period. And in the third experiment, we changed the items throughout, which was more about validating our broad spectrum hypothesis that if you use the same items, then maybe people can memorize a bit, but also you don't know how far it goes, right? So we changed up the items at every testing phase to see how broad spectrum, the kind of transference, maybe more in machine learning type of language, right? And so here we have the beginning, nothing going on. And then there's the effect, right? People find fake news less reliable. But it stayed this way for 3 months. So I said to Raccoon, that's not really possible. Even with COVID, you need to get booster shots with real vaccines, right? So something funky going on here. This would be too good to be true. And so in the second experiment, we indeed find something interesting that at the end, there's still a difference between control and inoculation. But you can see here, there's decay of about 50% that starts setting in. So people find fake news more reliable again. And so what was happening that we later confirmed is that when you engage people in between, you're actually boosting them. And so there's 2 mechanisms that are responsible for the decay of the inoculation effect. One is memory, people forget, and the other is motivation. People lose motivation. And you can boost both memory and motivation. And you can do a quiz to remind people of the content and get them interested again. You can do a replay of the game. You can do a video or a slideshow. It doesn't seem to matter. But what does matter is that you need to boost people. Otherwise, the decay wears off. It takes about a week to 10 days for the decay to set in. And then if you boost people, you can keep it active for a few months. We haven't gone to the point yet of life immunity, but if that's even possible. But we're looking to see how far it goes. Then we teamed up with the UK government, who helped us translate this intervention into every major language in the world. So bad news is freely available for anyone. It's educational, right? And we did some cross-cultural testing. People have done this in India, even independent replications. There's not much variation in Europe, okay? Western Europe, urban centers, all pretty similar. Even in India, what we actually found is that the urban-rural distinction seems to be more important than the country that you're in. So in urban areas in India, this replicates very well. When you go to rural areas where people don't use social media in the same way, where literacy is low, where people don't understand the type of social media sarcasm, memes, then you need a huge amount of adaptation. So we actually found that it doesn't work like this if people don't know the context, if people don't understand the jokes. And so you do need cultural adaptation when you're going into areas where digital literacy is just very different. But in most big sort of cities, you actually see pretty similar effects. Um, There've been meta-analyses of inoculation, helping people discern between manipulative and credible content. We've got a version for kids called Bad News Junior, and so the content's the techniques are the same, but the content's more age appropriate, right? So you're impersonating the high school principal that school is closed tomorrow, and SpongeBob and so on. We did one during the pandemic with the UK government and the World Health Organization. This was our biggest campaign at the time. So we did a short and brief. So Bad News 20 minutes, right? That's a deep dive. A lot of the feedback we got is that for a real campaign, that's too long. So we needed to create a version that was just 5 minutes for social media, focused on the three main techniques that were used during the pandemic. Grifters selling fake cures and conspiracy theories and fear mongering and stuff like that. And yeah, the World Health Organization made it part of their Stop the Spread campaign. It actually became also part of the United Nations Verified campaign. And through those partners, because we're scientists, so we don't go out and campaign stuff, but through these partners, we were able to reach over 200 million people at the start of the pandemic with this intervention. Became one of the most visited pages on the WHO page. We had initially named this game Unmasked, a bit of a joke for the WHO. I can tell you they did not find that funny. Um, and so it had to be something, factual, like, how misinformation goes viral on the internet. Um, Maybe of interest to the cybersecurity community, we then did one with during the 16 presidential, no, sorry, the 2020 presidential election with the Department of Homeland Security and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Structure Agency in the US, to try to safeguard the election from foreign interference. And one of the things that we looked at was how can we empower citizens to spot the playbook of foreign digital interference? And so we worked with Chris Krebs, who was heading CISA at the time, and he came up with this wonderful pineapple on pizza metaphor that we used as the basis for the game. And the idea was that you take an innocuous issue, should you put pineapple on pizza, right? And then you blow up both sides of the debate. You say, oh, it's going to offend the Italians, putting pineapple on pizza, disgusting, this is culturally inappropriate. And then the other side says, hey, this is America, nobody's going to restrict my pizza topping freedoms. And then you buy bots to amplify false amplification, right? And then you sort of create chaos in democracy. And the idea is that they don't do this with pineapple pizza, but of course abortion, race, immigration, they take those type of issues and deploy these techniques. And so we created a game that models and simulates these. And so there's an election caster, and Ashley Plug is running for Bear Patroller. It's an election game. There are no bears in Harmony Square, but they love elections so much that they're going to vote for a Bear Patroller anyway. And then you start floating misinformation that her animal abuse in college was unbearable. And so, dad jokes and all of that. And it gets the point across in a very sarcastic way, of course, of election interference. But then we test people with real content from social media. Somebody shot, they were out hunting and they were killed. Somebody commented 1.5 less MAGA Billies in the world. This was a Trump supporter. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. So not true false, but very polarizing, very toxic discussions. And so what we find is that people find this stuff less reliable in the inoculation game. They're more confident and less willing to share this stuff with other people. The same goes with extremism, violent extremism. We initially did a study teaming up with organizations that look at violent extremism and learning from them about what the playbook is. And there turns out there is a very systematic playbook. You identify vulnerable targets, online or offline. You gain their trust. you isolate them from their friends and family, and then you activate them to do something bad. And so we're able to create a simulation where we simulate an extremist recruitment attack on people, and you're being recruited to join the Anti-Ice Freedom Front, and your mission is to melt the global ice caps. So again, it's fictional and ridiculous, but it gets the point across. And then we target people with WhatsApp messages, So you have to understand, we're talking about disgusting people. They're out to hurt us, so we have to do something, right? Loyalty. If you want to join us for our next outing, come learn what we're all about. We're a tight knit group, right? You can't always trust people in your surroundings. Be skeptical, and we want to see if people become more resistant. And again, we find that they become relatively more immune in the inoculation group. And we actually replicated this in Iraq in areas formerly occupied by ISIS, where we did this on vulnerable youth to help them recognize radicalization attempts. And of course, it also spans the far right spectrum that use the same playbook, but for a different ideology. Um, Now, the idea so far, and this is the last bit I want to talk about. So Google technology companies approached us and said, we like what you're doing with this pre-bunking inoculation, but you've got this huge opt-in problem, right? Basically, you're creating these games and materials, but people have to be open. They have to opt in, and so you have a big problem in scaling this. We own YouTube, so what about the idea of creating animated videos where you pre-bunk misinformation in a short video, and then, those annoying ads on YouTube that you can't skip? What if we put the pre-bunk in those ad spaces so that people are inoculated before they potentially see any misinformation? Of course, at this point, I have to say that YouTube denies spreading any misinformation on their platform. But hypothetically, the idea is that, right, that you would be inoculated if there was such misinformation present. And the innovation was that they could make it non-skippable and then expose billions of people all at once. And so we thought this was a great idea. In fact, so we worked for years with Google, developing scripts where you tell people you might be targeted on the platform. Here's a weakened dose of what such an attack might look like. For example, scapegoating minority groups, and then giving people microdose examples of how to spot it in the wild. And YouTube is different from news sites, right? But there are these gurus that use manipulation techniques, and so again, you just break down the playbook and then expose people to weakened doses of scapegoating, ad hominem attacks, incoherence, emotional abuse, things like that. So we did a study where actually we did six RCTs, um, showing that this works. One of my favorite ones is the false dichotomy, which all politicians also love. It's like either you support this or that, and they leave out all the nuance. It's a way to breed extremist thinking. Um, and of course, at this point, the reviewer said, look, you've done so many inoculation studies. What we really want to see is that this works on social media. So it took us about a year to get Google, to get YouTube, to allow us to actually test this in the wild. And so we did a study where we gave people either manipulative or neutral versions of a post, right? Again, inoculation control. They saw one of these videos, which are hard to play online, but I'll tell you what it is. So Google was very concerned about this weakened dose thing. Like, they didn't want to synthesize any weakened doses of any real issues because they don't want to be arbiters of truth, right? So we had to go back to the drawing board and think of a completely inactivated dose. Like, what's an inactivated dose of a false dilemma? Like, ideally, we use a clip of a politician using a false dilemma, right? But John Rosenbeek, who I worked with, drew from our mutual generations pop culture. So we had a clip from Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith. Don't know if people like Star Wars, but the idea is that Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking to Anakin Skywalker. The spoiler alert, goes on to become Darth Vader, and he says, to Obi-Wan, he says, either you're with me or you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan says, only a Sith deals in absolutes, right? And then the narrator in the video says, don't use these manipulation techniques, don't join the dark side. And that's the weakened dose, right? But then we bombard people with actual examples, right? Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? We should be helping domestic homeless Americans instead, which is a false dilemma. Of course, there are resource constraints, but by all means, this is a false dilemma. Um, and then we actually test people. We were able to do a real campaign in the ad spaces on YouTube, about 1 million people. They allowed us to sample 30% randomly for a survey question. Those brand ads you get on YouTube? That's all they got. So that's what we had to work with. So we gave people multiple choice to see if they could spot the technique in question, the correct technique. Um, and there was about a 24-hour delay between exposure to one of these videos or the test, and so it wasn't immediate. So there's a lot of interference in YouTube in 24 hours, right? So what we found was that in the lab these videos work really well, very consistent effects in helping people. Red here is better discernment, so it helps people discern better. People become find this type of content um, uh, less trustworthy and are less willing to share it. But on YouTube, here are the effects. It was about a 5 to 10% boost in people's ability. That's much smaller than in the lab. But then again, when you look at companies, they spend millions on a 1% boost in brand recognition because they know that translates into X amount of sales, right? And so 10% boost was actually quite big for a single ad exposure. And these things are cheap. We're talking about, 5 cents an ad or something. Um, and so YouTube was quite pleased with these results. Unfortunately, and this is the problem working with social media companies, they have not made it mandatory in the ad spaces. But Google continues to do these campaigns on YouTube nonetheless. They've targeted over half the online population in Germany. Um, whataboutism, fear mongering, replicating these types of effects. Single ad exposure boosts people about 6% on average, about 10% for younger people. So it was more effective with younger people. They've done it during the EU campaigns in Europe. They've done it with Ukraine, Russia. We created a handbook for NATO on inoculation and how to spot cognitive warfare stuff. Um, Biden used inoculation against Putin, where he actually, when we were working with the State Department, he sort of deployed the same format where he warned people in advance that they had gotten a hold of intelligence that suggests that Putin was going to come up with a false pretext for the invasion. Then they administered a weakened dose of these manipulated videos, told people what's fake in those videos, how to spot the techniques, and which intelligence sources claim prevented polarization in the international community about the false pretext for the invasion, and it also forced Putin to come up with a new plan. And so, if it's true that an intervention like this can, you could say, well, it didn't work because he invaded Ukraine anyway, or you can say, well, but at least there, bought some time in delaying the attack because we've taken the wind out of it by pre-bunking it. And so there's, it's an interesting real world sort of case. Um, this Economist article talks about how this was done. Um, it's been written into the guidelines. So one of the things that we're going with now is that social media companies, Twitter was pre-bunking before Musk. Okay, they were doing the right thing. Then Musk fired everyone who worked on pre-bunking, and he's doing the opposite. He's spreading a lot of misinformation instead of fighting it. So we're going a different way now. So we're trying to get regulators to put pressure on social media companies to do the right thing. So inoculation's been written into the DSA for very large online platforms that they have to think about preemptive measures like this. We've used AI to power pre-bunking now, to automatically generate pre-bunks, to scale it further. Lots of exciting new research coming. I have my own propaganda. Mark Oliver already mentioned foolproof. Completely fake news, but if you're interested, and can't sleep at night, there's more detail there. Thanks so much for listening, and happy to have a discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot. The end was more abrupt than I thought. This is why I could not switch the screen so fast.
Yeah.
So great talk, wonderful talk, and I'm super happy having you here today because typically I have some computer scientist related people that are so much more from my daily operations, and so therefore I'm super happy having you today because that means I can discuss with someone from another field super important questions. So super nice talk. I really loved it. We have quite some audience questions, and we also have I also structured a bit the questions that we could go for. So let's maybe start again with this definition of fake content or fake news, because my question there is, isn't media mediated information always fake? What is the new quality? What changed with the advent of artificial, more generative large language models, artificial intelligence? Just to give you a scope where you could go.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to AI generated images, for example, I mean, yeah. So if something is manipulated, then it would count as fake. And so the question is it manipulated to mislead? I suppose that's more about intent and differentiating disinformation from misinformation. But content that is manipulated to not reflect reality, I think would fall under the definition of misinformation. Um, is all media mediated? I mean, I think the purpose of a lot of news organizations is to provide factual, objective, and neutral news. And when they use manipulation techniques to influence their audience, that's what we want to make people aware of. And so I think there's been a lot of things like the Trust Project, which gives news organizations trust badges based on how well they comply with these editorial criteria, not conflating opinion with fact, providing sources, being transparent about who's funding it. So I think people are manipulated in the media space often, and that should. I mean, at least some people agree that that should not be the objective of news. Um, and so that's kind of what differentiates. I think it's supposed to be objective and factual and so on, right? Talk about social media, it gets more of a gray area. I mean, social media companies, we had some good conversations about this. There's like, well, what do we do with people who just they're not news organizations. They just make a post, and let's say somebody posts, "I don't believe in climate change." That's just their opinion, right? And we shouldn't be policing people's opinions. Um, and their policy is about harm, right? And so a lot of these social media companies won't do anything unless there's a harm link. So if you post something that's harmful to other people or harmful to public health or harmful to elections, they can do something about it. But just a random opinion is tricky. And so in fact, sometimes some forms of climate denial can be linked to interfering with natural disaster management, for example. So there are exceptions that they can make, but yeah, it's a big discussion in terms of what's opinion and what's misinformation. I think the fact is that people do express their opinions on social media. Elon Musk does it all the time, and those opinions contain a lot of unsubstantiated, unverified facts. And so we do need to address that. I think a free speech preserving mechanism, for example, was Birdwatch or now Community Notes, where you crowdsource context in a not always, it can be hacked, but hopefully in a bipartisan way. And so I think those are some great mechanisms that signal that there is a need, that people do want accurate context to other people's opinions. And even when they don't explicitly label it as misinformation, I think people get a bit touchy about the labeling sometimes. But yeah, to me, anything that's misleading falls under the heading of misinformation.
Mhm. And would you say? I stick with an audience question first. So the question is there a difference on a neurological level between the suspension of disbelief and misinformation? If not, wouldn't that imply that we choose to believe hoaxes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's lots of interesting work on delusions, for example, but yeah, suspension of disbelief. I would say that if you look at the literature, there's competing hypotheses, right? One is a model of people want to be accurate, but they're being duped by others, or they're not paying attention, or there's too much information overload, right? But there's another model that says that people are motivated in their perception and in their search, and they seek out information that validates their own beliefs about the world, and that's a sort of willingly, suspending reality because you want to believe something that's true. I think both accounts are true. It just depends on the person and the context. I think sometimes, take something like vitamin C in the common cold. I mean, people are not willingly deceiving themselves. It's just a common misperception, right? Um, But if you talk about something highly political or like a conflict, something that people have a personal stake in, they're going to be motivated, and their search is going to be biased by their priors. And then you get the sort of, people are there's a demand for misinformation, and other peoples are feeding into that demand. And it can be difficult to disentangle in any given situation how much of it is motivated search versus people being duped by bad actors, and sometimes it's a little bit of both.
Hmm. Okay, very, very interesting. And what would you say about the habits of the receivers of news? Because I personally would say that the perceived increase and facilitation of having fake news also comes from people are watching shorter news. They are having different trust anchors. They're not looking at traditional news, but they are rather looking at social media. They're rather believing the uncle friend in the internet that they followed for some time and some more serious journalist maybe. So which role does this play in the entire playground that you are doing your research in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's also a very wide-ranging debate. Some people like Jonathan Haidt and the Anxious Generation, his book, very controversial. I mean, some people are just like, "Oh, social media are rewiring our brains," and other people say there's no evidence for that, and we need to research that much more in terms of causal evidence. It's very difficult to do because can you find people who have never been exposed to social media, for example, and then expose them and see if it changes brain activity? So these things are very difficult to do. But in a more narrow sense of your question, I think that there's some good research that shows that people's responses on social media become habitual. And so people are getting used to stimuli and receiving rewards from those stimuli. So, doing a short video, getting lots of likes, there's some really good reinforcement learning work which shows that the likes lead to an expectation of doing more of it, wanting more of it. And then a lot of it is just habitual clicking on a button. People are not necessarily, it starts out conscious, right? But once you learn that a certain action provides a rewarding consequence, then it becomes a habit and it starts to become unconscious. And some interesting modeling shows that you can account for a lot of social media activity just with a kind of a habit learning model, which I think is interesting because it calls for a different type of intervention, intervening on habits than when people are consciously doing something necessarily, right? And so I think the incentives on social media are all wrong. We've done a lot of research looking at what drives engagement on social media using big data. One of the best predictors is derogatory content, divisive content, extremist content. And so when the algorithms, right, are picking up on that, feeding it back to people, and people giving it's funny because a place like Meta, they'll say like, well, yeah, but we look at behavioral data. If we go to Instagram, people are telling us, we look at the likes, right? The algorithm looks at the likes, and then it learns what people like, and so it feeds people more of it. If people don't like it, then why are they clicking on it? And there's some interesting research that shows that if you ask people, they say, actually, I don't want that content in my feed. I don't want to engage with it. But then their behavior shows something else, and I think that illustrates that kind of like an addiction, people become trapped in rabbit holes. And on an anecdotal level, I'm on Instagram with videos about kids, about how to solve problems with little kids, funny videos about parents, and you just get sucked into it. And without realizing, an hour goes by, and you've wasted time on completely unsupported, unevidenced advice from influencers where there's no fact checking, no guardrails. Um, and I think that's a dangerous model that we need to do something about. But what's the alternative? I mean, we brainstormed about, okay, but if you make the algorithms prioritize accuracy or educational content, then we lose 90% of people. Nobody's going to make any money. And so, what's the balance between engagement-based algorithms versus other types of algorithms? It's tricky. We propose something like credibility badges that to try to go at a reputational level. That if you spread too much bad stuff, then you get a bad rating on your account, for example.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a big topic.
Okay, cool. And let's maybe dive in that question block a little bit into TikTok, because TikTok for me was a game changer in the sense it was really short videos, fast access, and an AI-based algorithm that was learning my preferences and constantly fuels me with positive reward because I get things that I want. End of this sentence. At the same time, there is information that in China, they indeed prioritize certain content for certain age groups in order to use this tool in order to do communication in a certain way, like educating people or reporting certain propaganda. End of this third stream. And third stream, the US now wants to ban TikTok, so this will also have an impact. So in that field of these three directions, can you share your thoughts there? So is TikTok really, was it a game changer, or is it just my perception? Is using it for educating people a good way? And is the banning in the US, what will be the effect of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of debate on this, and a lot of people understandably have reservations about, you know, hardcore measures like banning stuff or censoring stuff. Um, and you know, I think in the U.S. there's the concern, obviously, from the intelligence community is that you know it's China operated, right? So they're gathering data on U.S. citizens, and so there are issues with foreign interference that's driving that. Um, but on a social media level, yeah, I mean it's fascinating. I mean, the Instagram model is that you need to have a lot of followers, right? The structure of the network is such that you need to have a lot of followers in order to gain influence. On TikTok, you can go viral without having any followers, right? And so the algorithm is entirely different, and it creates for a very different experience. But people learn what the algorithm likes. I have a student who's on TikTok, millions of followers, and he learns that when he's explaining psychology videos, when he's creating shakes while he's talking, the algorithm picks up on like hectic stuff and likes it, and like driving more engagement towards it. And so influencers do figure out what the algorithm likes, right? And then it becomes a cycle. But yeah, a study from UNESCO found that 6 out of 10 influencers on TikTok, especially, say that they don't check the accuracy of what they're putting out. They don't see it as their role to check the accuracy. And this new influencer model is a different way of thinking about news and information dissemination. And it's great for some things, right? Social media can be great for certain things, but for accuracy of content and people getting their news from it and informing their health. I think that's where things get dangerous and actually potentially harmful, and it's difficult to intervene on TikTok and moderation. It's even more difficult in places like WhatsApp or Telegram, of course. But yeah, it's difficult. I'm not sure if banning. Wasn't there in France? There was where was it? There was kind of a light ban somewhere, and people just use VPN and find a way around it, right? So practically, I'm not sure how effective a ban is going to be versus, educating and empowering people to use it responsibly. Now, I don't want to shift the burden totally on people. It's also the social media companies that need to do it. Like one good solution I thought would be that you can't cater certain content towards certain age groups. That if we're going to have TikTok, you can't be targeting kids with certain types of content, for example. So limiting, and technically, I don't know how to achieve this, but technically limiting the types of content that different audiences can see to make sure that people are using it responsibly.
Mm-hmm. And very good. And about this, using such a platform for educating your population in a country, is that something where you have some thoughts on, some information from the psychology company? Is that something that's working? Because if China is doing that, it's a super intelligent tool. Everybody uses it. It's already on everybody's screen. And if you inject just some education videos, so now taking a positive thing, cool thing, because how else could you reach such a mass of young people that you want to educate?
Yeah. No, great question. Yeah, so there's research showing that using the influencer model on Instagram and TikTok can be a great way of virally dispersing factual information. Absolutely. Even places like National Statistics Office and the police are finding out that actually they can reach audiences on TikTok with factual information in ways that they couldn't before. So that's true. The problem is that it's completely asymmetrical. The few influencers that we have that are doing educational things are completely overwhelmed by misinformation. In fact, you saw that during the presidential election in the U.S. on X, for example, the local election officials said that they just couldn't keep up with the spread of misinformation, and there was so much to counter that there aren't enough people and resources. So theoretically, yes. I think practically there's not enough of it. So maybe one other way is actually to go back into education. That's what we're looking to do now. Is actually from a very early age um, help children and adolescents and inoculate, pre-bunk, empower them to use social media responsibly, so that by the time they come out as teens, they're going to be, resilient. And I think that's maybe a more stable way of ensuring the use of. Look at places like Finland, right, where people have high trust in institutions, high freedom of the press. Over 90% of the population is higher educated. They're very robust. So I think that's a good model to work towards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Another thought path. So when we look back 20 years or 25 years, YouTube started, and YouTube was the first democratization of mass media.
Mhm.
It got much more so today, as we just discussed. You have many people that never watch any traditional or consume any traditional news outlet. The only media they consume is social influencers on any platform. And so the theory now I say is like, okay, so you had quite restricted access to the people. Now you have full access to the people, and with content filtering and censorship in the neutral sense, you're restricting the bandwidth of the medium concerning content again. So is that something where you have some more thoughts on? Is that a rebound? Is it where will it go? Will it reopen? Will it stay unlimited? Do you have some thoughts in that direction?
Yeah, I think some people are obviously concerned that just as the fact that, and this is not a conspiracy theory, but there's a few billionaires who own most of the media companies in the UK, for example, the news groups, and so that's why the UK scored low on freedom of the press, because there's only a few that are, and they're all owned by the same corporations. But in a similar way, it's not great that a few billionaires own all the social media companies, right? That Musk and Zuckerberg own most of the platforms for information dissemination, and so that I think that is not a great model. And as we've seen, they can and will leverage it for political purposes. Um, the other thing I think is we're seeing much more fragmentation of the media landscape, and some people think this is a good thing. Like there's Blue Sky, right? There's Snapchat, there's Mastodon. Um, certainly in my own circles, people are fractured all over the place. LinkedIn, and so um, in one sense, that creates more echo chambers, right? That people are fragmented and they're all in their own echo chamber. So it actually becomes more difficult to reach people with one message because everyone's consuming a selective information that's supplied to different platforms. So it actually makes it difficult to broadcast corrections. But then it's useful in that it's diffusing the the ownership of social media, right? And that we have more competition. And so that's it's kind of a two-edged sword, I would say.
Mhm. And in that sense, I just want to emphasize again this echo chamber or filter bubble effect, because the problem is really that those in today's social media we have endless amount of content in quotation marks, and that
Hmm.
means these companies can just select which part of the content they want to show to be, and therefore they, even though it's a mass medium in the sense that the channel reaches masses, it's still very individualized. So there is only a small subgroup that gets exactly the same content, if even there is one. And so therefore, I just wanted to explain again your thought before, with if you control the algorithm that is deciding what is displayed to me, you're controlling a lot of the information getting into my head. Okay.
Yeah.
If you want
Go
to
ahead.
comment, feel free to do so. If not, I.
Um, No, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, feel free to go. No, I was going to say, yeah, I agree. But I think the problem is that there's a lot of work on trying to figure out what these algorithms are doing, but it's very difficult to actually study it, right? And so Facebook Meta funded these 10 papers that came out in Nature and Science, and said, hey, look, actually the echo chamber effect's not that bad, and there's not so much misinformation. But then it turned out that they didn't report that they made 63 changes to the algorithm during the study period, which suppressed a lot of misinformation. So I also find a bit of a moving target to try to study, the effect of algorithmic filtering on what people are viewing. And certainly YouTube, they've said like we've stopped putting out harmful content without people searching for it. But certainly when people are searching for it, then they get recommended more of it. But then, they blame the individual because you went out and searched for it, right? Um, and so initially, you saw in your feed, you saw random content and you clicked on it, and all of a sudden you're in an extremist echo chamber. So they have tried to take measures to not for the algorithm to not do that anymore. But yeah, I'm still not sure if it's great that even if you search for it, it should be perhaps discouraging you from clicking on it more rather than encouraging you. And those are obviously profit-driven decisions that are not lining up with what's in the public interest.
And in that direction, a question from Babel, which is if you can detect problematic content, let's leave it as vague as this, not to go into the censorship debate here, but if you can detect some problematic content, Twitter did this thing of flagging it and putting a discussion feed below. Is that a good model in the sense that we could use AI not to censor the content, but rather to say, okay, this is dangerous content, think twice before sharing it again? And did it work with Twitter? Was that positive, or was it rather, yeah, I don't care because I like it, I will still share it, I will still use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yeah, they like the community notes model because that doesn't introduce too much friction. So the prompting people think twice before you share, that's introducing friction, and so they don't like that too much. The research on that shows that it's minimally effective. So yeah, people will often still share because they want to share it anyway. But it does help some people, and so there's some evidence that that is helpful. Um, I think community notes. There's been a lot of research on crowdsourced ratings, and I think it's interesting because some of the people who advocate for crowdsourced ratings are sometimes skeptical of fact checkers because they perceive them as biased. But what's fascinating is that if you look at the research, the ratings of fact checkers correlate highly with those of bipartisan regular crowds, and so there is a ground truth benchmark that all the crowds agree that there's some ground truth. Um, and so for that reason, I don't mind if people want to use fact checkers or crowdsourced bipartisan ratings. I think there's wisdom in the regular crowd too, if the crowd's large enough. Their studies show that that does work on X, for example. That when people see the community note, that it's helpful. The problem is that community notes can't keep up with the amount of misinformation, so that it needs to be made more scalable in some way. And the other is that it can be hijacked by bad actors. And there's been studies on this too, that people of a certain partisan leaning will offline, they will collude to try to bias all the comments towards a certain outcome. So you can try to rig the community node system, by trying to overrun it with people of a particular agenda. So you need to have mechanisms in place that prevent that. But in theory, yes, I think those are good solutions.
And that also pushes me a little bit back to the beginning where I asked, like, what is the impact of AI? And I would say a major impact of AI is also that you can create a ton of targeted content in no time. And so that means you can really flood everything in no time at no cost. And this is something also that we didn't have at all in the past. And the reason why this is problematic is exactly what you just said, because the algorithms are statistical to some sort of sense. And so if you have a ton of things, of course, it's biasing the statistics of selecting or favoring or not favoring certain contents.
Exactly. A colleague of mine, Steve Lewandowski, did a paper on how you can use because back in the day there were whole hundreds of people manually doing the micro targeting, and how you can just use AI to boost thousands of these messages within minutes, and so that is problematic.
Mhm. Okay. So second bubble that I put here was human brain. Why are we so skeptical to fake news? On that we talked already because they are rewarding and it's often scandalous content and so on. So it's a little bit like the tabloid papers that we're also susceptible to because it's just things that interest us or because we have relations. But are there certain groups that are more susceptible and less susceptible? Is the level of education a relevant factor of it? Can you share a bit some insights on that?
Sure, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some general mechanisms that make everyone susceptible, like illusory truth. Like the more often you repeat something, the more likely people are to think it's true because the brain mistakes fluency for having some sort of truth value. So the speed with which you can process something is taken as a cue for veracity, and so that's why repeating lies often works. But there are also individual differences, and so yeah, people who are higher educated, score higher in what we call analytical thinking, more reflective thinking, are less susceptible to misinformation. But actually, one concept in particular called actively open-minded thinking is really crucial. Is that people who are rigid in their thinking and not open to new ideas can't step into to the mindset of other people. People are very uh, averse to uncertainty. Um, and the conspiracy theories tend to play into those things, right? They give people certain answers with kind of simplistic narratives. So yeah, so people who are low on being actively open-minded are much more susceptible to misinformation. And then age is an interesting thing. So older people share more political fake news, but younger people are more susceptible to fake news in general. And sometimes there's debates about is that because of declining memory with age, but then older people also have more experience, and so these are sort of counterbalancing forces. So age is kind of a tricky one. But in general, the profile of people who are highly susceptible is people who spend a lot of time in social media, people who are politically extreme, who are low in trust of official institutions, who are low in actively open-minded thinking. So that's kind of the typical pattern of people who are most susceptible and getting most of their news from social media. So it's a combination of structural and psychological factors. And then ideology, that's a contested one. Um, that people on the far right tend to be more susceptible than people on the left, and there's a big debate on, you know, is that because of a psychological difference or is it a structural difference? So some people say, you know, there are far right politicians that are just spreading much more from the top down, right? There's a lot of elite misinformation that is embroiling their own community, and so there's a kind of an oversupply, and that's why you see more sharing of misinformation on the right. And some people say, oh, there are psychological differences between the left and the right. So again, that's kind of an ongoing discussion.
Mhm. And an interesting positive thought is that when this inoculation and sensibilizing people for fake content works, it might also lead to a more resilient society, which would actually be quite positive because then people would not be so easily susceptible to something. Okay.
Correct.
Um, who would you say are the actors behind fake news? Is it, and what is the motivation behind? Is it advertisement for companies? Is it like the famous Coca-Cola one frame in the film? Is it state-based actors to influence voters? Is it people that want to have clicks? Is it all of this? So do you know about is there something structuring the field of the creators of the fake news? Is there something common to them or not common to them? Is that characterized? Do you have some ideas and news infos on that?
Yeah, there is some work on that. So yeah, I mean all of the above, but it is I think the most important mix is yes, there is kind of state, foreign propaganda, state actors, and of course there's been a lot of focus on China and Russia, but it's certainly true that the US or the UK at times has also participated in disseminating its own propaganda. So state-based propaganda, but then actually the top spreaders of misinformation, we use models from public health usually for this, is that they're super spreaders at a network level, right? So there tends to be a small percentage of super spreaders who are responsible for 80% of the misinformation, and those tend to be influencers and political elites who either have a financial or political motive to spread misinformation. So most of it is coming from a small minority of super spreaders who have financial or political motivations, and then people become the asymptomatic vector that a lot of people might be passing it on without realizing that it's misinformation.
And so with the US upcoming US government, at least the impression in the European media or in the French and German media that I consume most is that this is a constant machine of targeted news in the sense that they create news that they are in favor of, and the global society seems to soak them in like a swamp. Like, oh yeah, Bitcoin, cool, yeah, 100,000 plus. Tesla rising, whatever, Palantir rising. Is the existence of such a state government, including Elon Musk, that is using media for targets, for very, very targeted communication in maybe the most extreme form that other countries do not do as obvious as this. Do you expect this to have an effect, for instance, into the direction that the people will get totally tired and not believe anything anymore, be totally confused, have more psychological problems? Do you have some thoughts in that direction?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, there's not enough work on that, but certainly people have hypothesized that a first past the post system or a two-party system makes you more vulnerable to hyper-partisan polarization and debates and selective dissemination of information. So the way that it's structured, and it's not entirely dissimilar here in the UK, is that um, you get a much more polarized and hyperpartisan landscape, which I think is a breeding ground for misinformation. But then also, some people certainly seem to suggest that there's also this demand factor, right? That a lot of research shows that people may not like Trump, or at least some polls seem to show people may not like Trump, but they're knowingly voting for this person. And there's the question: are they misinformed, or are they duped, or are they willingly misinformed? Right? That's kind of the question. And I think it's hard to disentangle. But certainly, when you're in a hyper partisan echo chamber, it becomes much harder for people to get information outside of their bubble. And I do wonder if in the US that would speak more to the fact that people are not knowingly duped. So people, for example, believe that they're voting for policies that make sense to them, without knowing that actually they might be completely misconstruing the evidence for those policies. And that's probably because they're in a hyperpartisan echo chamber. Whereas the other hypothesis is that actually people know quite well. It's just that they have a need for chaos, and they want to, there's kind of more of a populist drive that people want to see change, and they want to see change at all costs, and they don't care about accuracy, and they just want to elect someone who's going to shake things up. Um, and so that, and I think that type of populist sentiment is also present in Europe. And I think it's much more tricky to think about how to deal with that, right? If it's deeply motivated versus kind of just coming at people and they're not discerning it correctly. So yeah, in terms of what to you know, if you look at Europe, for example, a lot of the the there are differences in the systems, but you still have some similar populist rhetoric. So that does lead to the question, are people kind of willingly doing this? And then that's actually much harder to address, I think, than an information deficit.
Mm-hmm.
I have to run soon if you don't mind, but we did cover a lot of ground here. It's been fascinating. So we do. Did you have any more burning questions from the audience, or?
Yeah, so questions, how much time you have? Do you have 3 more minutes roughly? Is that fine with
Yeah,
you?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. So going back to the tech part. So I would say when we look at a technology evolution from the early known fakes like with the Russian Revolution, pictures with Lenin and so on were manually edited, people were removed and so on. Fast forward, internet, digital media, high speed processors, and now AI. Could you say which are the major technical reasons why that made the fake news gets easier or more difficult to create and the quality of fake news increased and so on? Is it the case even, or would you say, yeah, it's still like it was 100 years ago, it just shifted the medium?
Yeah, I mean, I see some people be skeptical like that. I think some of the techniques are perhaps similar to what politicians did 100 years ago. I mean, certainly in my book, I talk about some of the propaganda during the Roman era, which used some of the same strategies as politicians use now. But I think the point that evidence that I go through is that the way that it's disseminated and coming at people is totally different. I mean, back in the day, people weren't dealing with algorithmic feeds. People weren't dealing with micro-targeted content. The velocity with which information travels. I actually calculated in the book, I think, how long it would take by horse and carriage to get a message across versus, on WhatsApp, and how many people can you reach, at any given time. So I think people are struggling with this concept that some collaborators call technocognition, is that, our cognitive systems are not necessarily adapted to the technology that we're using, which I think does fundamentally create a different dynamic that people have with receiving and sending information, and that does impact, I think, the way that not only fake news travels, but how people share it and whether they believe it or not. I mean, um, it's in some ways also much more impersonal, but it depends on the social network that you're talking about, right? So on WhatsApp, there's this sort of trust factor that people trust incoming information because it comes from a group that you belong to, even though that people forward lots of totally unevidence-based stuff in WhatsApp groups, right? Whereas on other social media, it's much more anonymous. Um, but people don't seem to be fact checking in the moment. It's very difficult to do. I mean, interventions that try to teach people about lateral reading, so opening up another tab, double checking, googling. I mean, people resist this all the time. They don't want to do that. And so, that does create a very different information environment. At least with legacy media, there's fact checkers, there's editors, there's producers, there's guardrails in place, right? But even with the onset of cable news, you got the conflation between opinion and news, and much more kind of free flow of unverified content. And so I wouldn't say that social media is the only problem. Cable news is also spreading a lot of misinformation. Podcasts are also, audio is also kind of a new form of engaging with information. And how do people think about, an audiobook? How do you know whether something is true that you hear? Do you accept it as fact? Are you gonna go and Google it yourself later to verify it? No, most people won't do that. So I do think that the technology is changing the way that people interact with information.
Okay, great. Last question. Which are trends that you anticipate? Which are current research problems that are interesting that might lead to such trends?
Yeah, well, I think deepfakes and Gen AI is a huge problem. And so, when it comes to inoculation, for example, you need a playbook and you need cues, but the cues for deepfakes are obviously changing fast. And so, context is really all you have. It doesn't make sense for the Pope to wear a puff jacket, right? Or to see a table outside of a plane window. And so, but as technology changes, the context might become more difficult to discern. So how do you inoculate when you can't distinguish what's synthetic from what's real? So that's a challenge that we're currently trying to figure out. How can you inoculate against Gen AI generated manipulation, if at all? Um, and I think the other is how to scale solutions, which is a big problem. How can you scale some of these solutions without having to rely on governments or social media companies? So those are sort of two big things that I'm thinking about.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Sandro. It was a really great pleasure. I really loved the talk, and this was one of the talks again that will go on in the discussion and so on with the people for quite a while, I guess. So thanks a lot for your perspective, and thanks a lot for having taken the time for sharing all this with us. So really, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to be here. And again, apologies for being a little late, but hopefully we, still a good discussion. And let's stay in touch.
Definitely. And so, yeah, thanks a lot. And so this was the last edition for this year. The next edition will on the 31st of January. It will be on the Sixth Sense for AI algorithms, challenges on confidentiality, trust, and security for mobile devices. And the speaker will be Soumya Banerjee. And until then, stay safe, keep the discussion on cybersecurity, and see you all safe in January. Goodbye.
Cher CyberCNI, pôle d'excellence région Bretagne. Au revoir et à la prochaine.